Okay, today's daf is Eruvin Daf Lamed Vav. Today's daf is dedicated by Rachel Bentley. I'm so grateful to be able to participate in this cycle of Daf Yomi. I want to thank you all. Who would have thought at the outset that we would be living in such strange times? My Montreal group arranged to meet as we finished Masechet Brachot, but of course, even as we finished Masechet Shabbat, we've still not met in person, but also by the miracle of Zoom. My prayer is to meet in Israel after completing, by the grace of God. Many thanks and my wishes for good health and safety for all. And in honor of Jonathan Cohn, my brother, on his birthday today, who's been keeping up with the daf since actually before the beginning of this cycle, starting from Masechet Nida. Keep it up. Okay, we're going to start now with the end of yesterday's daf. Just to review, we started with a Mishnah about someone puts food down for his Eruv, and what happens? The food rolls out of the tchum, gets covered up by rocks, or we're going to focus a lot on it was truma, and it becomes tameh, okay, or it burns, but that was another option, but it becomes truma and it becomes impure, and we saw there was a machloket there, and these are the two opinions we're going to deal with today. Rabbi Yossi, it's Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Shimon, but we're really focusing on Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Meir, because their words seem to contradict what they said in other places. So Rabbi Meir in our Mishnah said that's a chamar gamal. Remember, the person who is leading both a donkey and a camel, which is being basically pulled in different directions, meaning it doesn't work, and Rabbi Yossi, who says it works. So we started with a contradiction between, we did a few things about Rabbi Meir. We said Rabbi Meir must say it doesn't work because safek deoraita l'chumra, he must hold eruv tchumen is deoraita, and that's why he's stringent. And then we said, but it seems to contradict what he says elsewhere, because we had this case of someone who comes in contact with a dead body and doesn't know, with a body, he then in the morning or a few hours later or sometime later, it could be even a few minutes, turns out the person was dead, and it's not clear whether the person was dead when the person was in contact with them or not. So the question is, in that case, Rabbi Meir says he's tahol, he's pure. How could that be? Rabbi Meir is machmir by us, but Mekel, he's more lenient there. So we saw the answer in the Gemara, and let's just go through it again. Rabbi Yirmiyah says, I'm a Rabbi Yirmiyah at the bottom of Lamed Hey. He says the answer is, Mishnatenu, we're five lines from the bottom, Shaya alav sheretz kol ben hashmashot. There was a sheretz, that's tamei, on the truma during the whole time of ben hashmashot. So now they say, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. Didn't we say it's a safek? And Rabbi Yossi says it's okay. If the sheretz was there all ben hashmashot, then of course it's tamei. So that can't be the case. So Rav and Rabbi Yosef explain what he means. So let's explain this a little more than we did yesterday. Always when we get to the end of the daf, we're rushing. I don't get to explain everything. So what happens here? There were two groups of witnesses. One said there was a sheretz on there, all ben hashmashot, and one said, no, there was no sheretz ben hashmashot. Okay, so we have what we call contradictory evidence. Rabbi Yossi says simply, and Rashi explains this very well, if you look at the last Rashi. So Rabbi Yossi holds, okay, tre lebahade tre. In other words, you have two contradictory witnesses. What do you do when you don't know if they're telling the truth or not? So he basically says, 2 against 2, they're all knocked out, which means we're back to square one. Now, what was square one? Square one is, we have a chazaka. Okay, let's go back to the dead body case. Why does Rabbi Meir say that the person is going to be tahol? Because Rabbi Meir says, let's go, when you touch the body, what did we know about the body from before? The last thing we knew about the body was that the person was alive. That's what we call a chazaka. That person has a chazaka that they were alive until such time that we know they were dead. It's kind of like innocent until proven guilty, right? Till you know, it's a little different there because there we're judging someone based on some action that happened before. But theoretically, what we're saying is right now, right? Well, now we know they're tamei, but then we didn't know, and we go by what we knew them to be before they were alive. In this case, comes Rabbi Yossi, and he says the same thing. If you have contradictory witnesses, we basically knock everybody out. It's as if we have nothing, which means we go by the chazaka. What was the chazaka? This was truma that was pure. Until such time that we know it became impure, it's fine. Comes Rabbi Meir, and he says something interesting. He says, and this is according to Rashi anyway, I'm reading 3 lines from the bottom. It says when it comes to Doraita Sveikot, he says like this. since even we don't view contradictory witnesses as if they don't exist, we have two sets of witnesses. One says there was a sheretz on it. One says there wasn't a sheretz on it, right? Ben hashmashot. So because we have one set of witnesses that says they testify it was their ben hashmashot, then basically, he says very interestingly, that overrides our chazaka. So now we're wiped clean with the chazaka. Instead of Rabbi Yossi saying we're wiped clean with witnesses as if no witnesses came, they say no, because two witnesses came and said there was a sheretz there, that wipes out our chazaka. We have no chazaka that the food was tahor, and therefore we've gotten rid of our chazaka, and now we're left with what we have right now, which is it's tameh. And therefore, Rabbi Meir says we have to assume that it was tameh earlier. In other words, we have to go by the worst case scenario. That's why it's b'doraita. We're going to go worst case scenario. We have witnesses that say it was tameh. Therefore, even though maybe they're lying and maybe the other witnesses are right, still we're going to be more stringent. Okay, so that explains one explanation of the contradiction between Rabbi Meir with the dead body, where he goes by the chizkat chayim, what the person was before, whereas in the Eruv case, he doesn't go by what it was before, he goes by what it is now. Rava explains it differently. He says, Hatam tre chezke lekula. V'hacha chada chazaka, it should actually be lechumra. It says lekula, it should actually be lechumra. When there's two chazakot, okay, what's the two chazakot? In the dead body case, we have two chazakot, and that's why we're lenient. When it comes to one chazaka, we're not going to be lenient. With the food, we only have one chazaka. We have chazaka that the food was tahor in the beginning, but now it's tameh, and therefore one chazaka is not enough. But we have two chazakot in the dead body case. What do we have? Well, we knew the person was alive. The last thing we knew before we now know they're dead was that the person was alive. Number two, the person who came in contact with that person had a chizkat tahara. They were also pure. So we have two chazakas here. Both people were b'chizkat, not tameh. And therefore, one was presumably alive and not dead, and the other was presumably tahor and not tameh. So therefore, two chazakas, we're going to be more lenient. But when it's only one chazaka, we're not going to follow it. So those are two different possibilities to understand the contradiction between Rabbi Meir. Now we get to Rabbi Yossi. Kasha de Rabbi Yossi ad Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi also contradicts himself. And if you want, you can look at the sheet, because here I put it both sources. We have our Mishnah. If you remember, I told you we're going to go back to this. Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon say, if it went outside the Tchum or the Tchum Rabbanit made or all those cases, Safek Eruv Kasher. Now, if you remember, we saw yesterday this case about Tuma de Rabbanan and Tuma de Oraita, where you're tameh either on a Doraita level or you're tameh on a de Rabbanan level, on a rabbinic level. And what happens? You go to a mikvah, but we're not sure, did you actually go in the mikvah? We're not sure if the mikvah had the requisite amount of water. We're not sure, right? There's all sorts of sfikot. And there, Rabbi Meir said, it depends if it's Doraita de Rabbanan. Safek Doraita, we're stringent. If it's a doubt regarding Tuma that was on a rabbinic level, we're more lenient. But Rabbi Yossi there said, even Tuma on a rabbinic level, we're going to be stringent and say that you're impure, that you're basically, it didn't work. So now it seems very strange. Why is Rabbi Yossi stringent there and lenient here, right? Each approach is the opposite. So we're going to have three answers. If you can look at the chart, you can see three answers. The first and the third answer, we're going to question and then give an answer to. Okay, those are both going to be somewhat problematic. So let's see. Amar Rav Huna bar Chinina, Shane Tum'ah Ho'il v'yesh la ikar min haTorah. Tuma is different because Tuma de Rabbanan has a basis in Torah law. In other words, yes, it's rabbinic, but the whole concept of Tuma is Torah in its nature, comes from the Torah. So therefore, right, all the rabbinic prohibition or Tuma, the rabbinic impurities, are all to prevent from Torah impurities. So therefore, we're going to say, well, it has ikar min haTorah. And that's why Rabbi Yossi views it more as a Torah law, even though it's rabbinic. It's because it has a basis in the Torah. So what's the obvious question? Shabbat nami d'oraita. What do you mean? Shabbat is also d'oraita, and specifically, it sounds like they mean Eruv Tchumen is d'oraita. So obviously, what are they going to say? Kasava Rabbi Yossi Tchumen de Rabbanan. He would have to say that Tchumen is rabbinic. Okay, and then you'd have to say a few things. There's two interesting things that come out of this. One is you would say Tchumen must be inherently different from all the other melachot, because if it's not inherently different, then, well, first of all, if it's Darabanan, it's obviously inherently different. But you could still say, even though Tchumen is Darabanan, the whole concept of Shabbat is Torah law. So why don't we say, since it comes from a Shabbat-related issue, and Shabbat is Doraita, but they don't say that. So you'd have to say, Tchumen doesn't really come, it's not an outgrowth, let's say, of the Malachot. That's one thing. Another thing is there's a big issue that comes up in this whole Tchumen Derabanan. We didn't really get to this, but there's a whole debate about Tchumen Derabanan. What does it mean, Tchumen Derabanan? Does it mean any issue of Tchumen Derabanan? Or some people say the 2,000 Amma is Derabanan. But on a Doraita level, you still, even those who hold Tchumen is Derabanan, on a Doraita level, you can't walk what's called Yud Bet Mil, which is a lot farther than 2,000 Amma. And that's the Doraita law, but there's a rabbinic, but what we've been talking about, all the 2,000 Amma, which is much less space, that is all rabbinic in nature. Now that can't work in with this Gemara. This Gemara is a serious question for that approach, because from here, it seems very clear that there's nothing Doraita about Tchumen, because if it was, Rabbi Yossi would be Machmir, just like with Tuma. So this is a good problem with that approach, okay? And I think it's the Ritva who basically raises that as an issue. Says, this sugya clearly seems to imply, according to those who say Tchumen Derabanan, it's 100% Derabanan and not the 2,000 Amma Derabanan, but Yud Bet Mil would be Doraita. The Ibait Ema, second answer, Hadidei, Hadirabe. We've seen this answer a lot. We just had it with Rabbi Meir. That one is his approach and one is his rabbi's approach, and he just doesn't hold that way. Okay, so two different approaches, and which one is which? Well, we're going to see right now. Daikanami Dekatani, here's to strengthen that position. In our Mishnah, what did Rabbi Yossi say? He quoted in the name of Avtumus, so that could show potentially this isn't really his opinion. He's quoting in the name of Avtumus. Third answer, Rava Amar Hatdamai Nutama de Rabbi Yossi. Says, in the case of the Tameh person, what do we say? Well, maybe Rabbi Yossi says, in our case, if we go by Chazaka, what they're basically going to say is, Rabbi Yossi holds by Chazaka. Okay? Chazaka, again, means whatever we knew to be in the beginning. Well, when it comes to the Eruv, so when we put it down, it was perfectly fine. So we can go by Chazaka. When it comes to a Tameh person who goes to the mikveh and we're not sure if they actually went or if there was a problem with the mikveh or whatever it might be, well, let's go back to the original chazaka. The chazaka was the person was impure. So we're going to stick with the original, what the status was. We're going to assume nothing changed in both cases. If you assume nothing changes in Eruv, your Eruv is good. If you assume nothing changes in mikveh, then the person's going to be Tameh, impure. It means the mikveh didn't work. So that's why he's stringent there and lenient here. Okay, that would explain it. But now the Gemara says, what do you mean? If you're going by chazaka, there's a different chazaka by the mikveh case. Why don't you say, if we're not sure, does the mikveh have 40 se'ah or not have 40 se'ah? Why don't you say, well, we knew it had 40 se'ah, maybe some water evaporated or spilled out, and that's the concern, but why don't we just go by, if it's all about, let's go by what we knew originally, then we should say the mikveh is good, and then the person his tefillah should have worked. So the answer, it must be b'mikveh shalonim dad. It must be he dunked in a space that they never measured. And the whole question is, did it have 40 se'ah to begin with or not? But if it had 40 se'ah to begin with, then based on Rabbi Yossi, we go by chazaka, we can assume that it really did have 40 se'ah and it would be good. Now we're going to bring a braita about Rabbi Yossi, and I'm going to make some distinctions here. Tanya, Ketzan amar Rabbi Yossi safek eruv kasher. In which case does he hold that safek eruv works? This was our Mishnah. Irev b'truma, safek. We're now going to talk about two different types of sfeiko by truma. So he puts down truma, but now what's the safek? Safek mi ba'od yom nitmet, safek mi chashecha nitmet. We know it became impure. We just don't know when. We now have fruits, another case, fruits that at some point someone was mafresh trumot mascho from them, someone tithed them. But right now, we don't know when. We don't know were they tithed before or after. Now, if they were tithed before Ben Hashmashot, then they're fine. If they were tithed after Ben Hashmashot, which you're actually not allowed to tithe on Shabbat, but let's say someone did, So they weren't ready for eating ben hashmashot, which means your eruv isn't good. So if you have fruits that you know were tithed, you just don't know when, safek mibod yom nitkanu, safek mishachashecha, was it when it was still day, or was it once it got dark out after ben hashmashot nitkanu, zeu safek eruv kasher. So in these cases, what's the situation? We know they're, okay, now it's a little tricky. In one, we're going to say, right, the truma, it was good to begin with. The fruits, we're going to assume they were fixed from the beginning, okay? Now, there are two reverse cases because the truma starts out being good and the fruits start out being bad. And the Gemara is going to get back to this. It seems, right, this shouldn't be the same exact case. So let's hold off on that for right now. But basically, it's going to say, if you know that they were either good or either bad, we can assume that it was good. We could paskin lekula, okay, lenient. Aval, erev b'truma, safek tahora, safek tme'ah. But if you have truma and you don't know, was the truma pure or not? Okay, in other words, you don't know if the truma from the beginning was, maybe it's truma tme'ah. There it's a safek about the status. The status, it's not a matter of when, it's a matter of if. Was it tameh to begin with? V'chein beperot, safek nitkanu, safek lo nitkanu. You use for your eruv fruits and you don't know. Are they tevel? Did someone not tithe the produce or not? Then, ein zeh safek eruv kasher. This doesn't work. So now the Gemara goes back to the first one. Ma'ishna truma. Now in truma, what did we say? Why does the truma work according to him? We've already said this a few times. Da'amar ha'amed truma achezkato ve'ema torai. We assume the truma is its an original status. And what was its original status? It was pure. So why don't we say, let's just assume it's kept its original status. But peirot, if you want to say the same with fruits, this is what I told you. It's the opposite. If you want to say, let's keep it with its original chazaka, what we knew to be true, we should say, well, what did we know to be about the fruits from the beginning? Well, they weren't tithed in the beginning. So therefore, according to Rabbi Yosef, his whole thing is we go by what we knew to be in the beginning. We knew in the beginning this was untithed produce. So of course, we should assume it should stay as untithed produce. We can assume until we know otherwise, which means it shouldn't work. So why does Rabbi Yossi say it works? So therefore, they're going to have to change what Rabbi Yossi was talking about in this case, in this Braita. Lo tema safek mi ba'od yom nitkanu. Don't say, right, that was the case. No, it's a different case. You have to find a case that's parallel to the truma case, where originally it was good, and now we're just not sure if it's good. So what would that be with tithe produce? Ela ema safek mi ba'od yom nidmeu. Safek mi shechashecha nidmeu. I don't know if you remember this phrase. Nidmeu. Nidmeu means that I had produce, I tithed it, everything was fine, I took my trumot u'masrot, but what happened? It fell into a pile of untithed produce, and now it's all mixed up, right? This is your classic case in the Gemara. They love these discussions of mixed produce, right, where it's safek. So now we're not sure, did it fall into that? Once it falls into other tevel, now you're stuck, you have to fix it because now it's mixed up with untithed produce. So basically, the whole question is, when did it fall into that batch of untithed produce? Was it before Ben Hashmashot or was it after Ben Hashmashot? Okay, and then that's the whole question. And then it becomes a parallel case because then we could say we go by its original chazaka, which is we took the Trumot Masrot and everything was fine. Now we're going to have a bunch of questions. So until now, we basically had these contradictions between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Meir. They contradicted themselves. We resolved them, right? Rabbi Meir, we had 2 answers. Rabbi Yossi, we had 3 answers. Then we went into this distinction Rabbi Yossi makes between if it's a safek about the status, right? Is it or is it not? Then we're not going to allow this because then if it's safek about its status, we just don't know anything about it. Okay, so now we're stuck. We can't say this works in Eruv. If it's something about when it happened, then we get to rely on the original state, okay? I see someone's asking about batal b'shishim. So when it comes to truma, we don't say batal b'shishim, we have batal b'mea because it's more significant. So then if it's tevel, right, what do we say? No, well, that's truma that falls in. Maybe tevel, I forget now with tevel what we say. but it could be batel at something, but it doesn't matter because we're talking about where it's not batel b'shishim, where it would fall in a significant measure, and then you wouldn't be able to say it was canceled. Okay, moving on. By Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak me'er Rav Huna. Hayu lefanav shtei kikarot. You have two loaves in front of you. Echad tme'ah ve'echad tehora. You have one impure, one pure. So they're both truma, so you can use truma. Remember, we learned you can use truma, but one is impure, which obviously you can't use because that's supposed to be burned. It doesn't work. But you don't know which is which. So Amar, Irvuli b'tohora b'kol makom shu. Whichever one is tehora, I want that to function as my eruv. Does that work? So, mahu. Now they're going to say very interestingly, tibai leRabbi Meir v'tibai leRabbi Yossi. Both according to Rabbi Meir, who says normally we'd say we're machmir, we're stringent. Maybe here we'd be lenient. And likewise with Rabbi Yossi, who's lenient in the other Safek Eruvin cases, would say here stringent. Why? We're going to read it right now inside. Tibai leRabbi Meir. You might say, ad kan lo ka'amar Rabbi Meir hatam deleka tehora. Hacha ha'ika tehora. Maybe you would say, when Rabbi Meir did it, when Rabbi Meir said we're going to be machmir, it's because right now, what does he see in front of him? Truma that became impure. So he's not willing to say our eruv was good and we go by the original because maybe it really was a problem. And he also says, chumin's d'oraita, we're going to be machmir. But in this case, you have two loaves. One is definitely pure. So you basically have a definite eruv according to him. And therefore, maybe he would say this works. What's the flip side? Odilma, maybe you would say, afilu l'Rabbi Yossi lo ka'amar hatam dim ita di lo ka'amar ela hatam. He only allowed it there. Why? Dim ita di Torah yadale. Because there's what is he saying? His whole theory is we go by the original chazaka. And our chazaka is that we knew this loaf was good to begin with. So we're good. But aval hacha halo yadala. But here you have an eruv that has a big question mark on it. You don't really know which one you're using for your eruv, so there's no definite eruv here. There we assume there was a definite eruv because you put down a loaf of bread that was totally pure. Yes, it's true it got messed up along the way, but we can assume that happened later. Here, there's no, you can't just, or you can't necessarily, we don't know, that's the whole question. We can't necessarily say that this works because you said maybe this one, maybe that one. There's no definitive eruv here. Okay, there was a definitive eruv. It's just something happened along the way. And it's just a question of when did it happen. But here, there's no definitive eruv. So that's the problem. He says, and it's his whole theory, or the Gemara's, when asking this question, is saying, maybe you have to have knowledge about what is functioning as your eruv. You can't just say maybe this or maybe that. And we're going to get into lots of questions about this later on today. Amar lei, ben l'Rabbi Yossi, ben l'Rabbi Meir, be'inan seudah ha'reuya miba'od yom v'leika. Says, so the answer given is, according to both of them, it has to be something that you could have eaten miba'od yom, and here you have a big problem, because you couldn't have eaten either of these loaves, because you don't know which is the tahor one and which is the tameh one. So since you couldn't have eaten your eruv, this obviously doesn't work according to all the opinions. Next question. Let's say you say, today my loaf is regular, but tomorrow I'm sanctifying it to the temple, tomorrow being Shabbat. So now the big question is, when you say tomorrow, okay, this goes back to our whole big question about Ben Hashmashot, do you mean beginning, right? Do you mean from sunset of Friday, or do you mean from when the stars come out on Friday night? When did you mean that it's going to be Kodesh? What's the issue? Well, Hekdesh can't be used for an Eruv. You can't say, right, if it doesn't belong to you, Hekdesh belongs to God, basically to the temple. So you can't say, this is, my Hekdesh is an Eruv. So the question is, if the whole important time is Ben Hashmashot, well, if your Hekdesh only kicks in once it's dark out, the beginning of definite Shabbat, then, right, it's all a question of what did you mean when you said lemachar? What does lemachar mean? So if you said hayom cholu lemachar kodesh va'amar irvuli bazen, you said make this my eruv mahu. Amar lei eruvo eruv. It works because we assume that the hekdesh doesn't kick in till nightfall. Hayom kodesh u'lemachar chol. But if you say today it's sanctified and tomorrow it will be chol. Now, how do you do that? You can't just remove hekdesh. How do you remove hekdesh? You redeem it onto a coin. Okay? So there are some people who say that you can actually give hekdesh for a certain period of time, and maybe that's what they mean. Or others say, what you're saying is basically you put a coin aside and you say, when tomorrow kicks in, it's going to be redeemed onto this coin. Okay, so today it's going to have its, I don't know why you would do this, but today it has its state of Kodesh. Tomorrow, when Shabbat kicks in, the sanctity will be removed and go on the coin. So if you say that, the question's going to be, when did you mean when you said Lamachal? So if you say that, Mahu, Amarle, Ein Eruvo Eruv. It doesn't work because we're going to assume it's still in its Hekdesh status. Okay? So Maishna, what's the difference between the two? Why do we say it works there and it doesn't work there? Amarle, we've seen this before. Okay, this is a question Rava asked Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman responds and says, go figure it out yourself, okay? And it's go eat a core of salt. You know, once you've eaten a core of salt, you'll figure it out. We have a bunch of different interpretations what that means, right? Either it means, right, a core of salt is a ton of salt. People don't generally eat that much, right? What he's basically saying is go figure it out. Go spend some time on it and figure it out yourself. Hayom chol u'lemachar kodesh. So now the Gemara explains. When you say today is chol and tomorrow is kodesh, misveka lo nachta le kedusha. Because of a suffix, and we're not sure, we assume the kedusha doesn't fall till later. But hayom kodesh u'lemachar chol, misveka lo paka le kedusha te'mineh. If you say hayom is kodesh and machar is chol, because of a suffix, we don't allow the kedusha to be removed, right? It's to not have the kedusha fall, we can say we could push that off. But to have the Kedusha stay, we're going to have the Kedusha remain until we know for sure that you meant to take the Kedusha off. And that's why it doesn't work in the second case. Okay, another Mishnah that relates to our situation. Tanan Hatam. Lagin Tvul Yom Shemal Omen Achavit Shama'asel Tevel. What happened? There's a lot of terms here we need to understand. Tvul Yom is someone, usually it's a person, but here it's a utensil that was in the mikvah, but it has to wait till nightfall to be pure, just like a person. So you put it in the mikveh already, it's a kli, but it's tamei still until nightfall. So what happens? You filled it up, okay? It's full of maaser. Maaser means you gave it to a Levi. Now what does the Levi have to do? It's maaser tevel. The Levi has to take truma from the maaser. Remember, he has to take a tenth and give it to the Kohen. He didn't do that yet, which means that these fruits are not, you can't use them on Shabbat. So what do? What's the problem? You're in a quandary here. Because it's Erev Shabbat, you could theoretically take, so you could pour out wine and leave the wine in this kli. But if you leave it in the kli, what's going to happen? The truma that you leave in the kli is in that utensil. The utensil is still tamei. Until nightfall, it's not going to be pure. So it's going to mess up your truma. It's going to disqualify your truma. And it cause it to be impure. And you're not allowed to make truma impure. So what does he do? He says, Amal, harei zeh trumat ma'aser lecheshet tershach. You can't take truma on Shabbos. So what do? You say, listen, I'm standing right now in Erev Shabbat when I'm allowed to do it. I'm saying right now, I'm pouring wine out into something else. That wine is going to be my wine on Shabbat. I'm going to drink it on Shabbat. I can't drink it now because I haven't taken the truma from it. But what I've left in this other utensil will become truma as soon as the nightfall comes, which means at that point, the kli will already be, the utensil will be pure, and then the truma won't be disqualified, so that works. So you can do that. But imamar irvuli bazeh. But if you say I want to use that truma wine as my or any of the wine as my eruv, lo amar klum. It doesn't work because why? Ben hashmasho, you need it to be worthy. Remember, and this isn't going to be usable ben hashmasho because it's still maser that you haven't. It's maser tevel. You haven't taken truma from it. So Amar Rava, what does Rava derive from here? Zot omeret, sof hayom koneh eruv. This proves that when is the eruv kick in? When's the moment that's most important? The beginning of Ben Hashmashot. Okay, it's actually confusing. Sof hayom and tchilat hayom mean what you would think the reverse. Sof hayom means the end of Friday, which basically ends at sunset. Tchilat hayom means when Shabbat definitively begins, which is at nightfall. Okay, three stars. So he says, if you thought it was when Shabbat starts, you might still say, obviously it has to be Ra'oi ben Hashmashot, but you might still say But maybe it's the moment that Shabbat kicks in definitively. That's the important moment. He says it's obviously that that's not the case. Because if it was Sof Hayom Konei Eruv, Tchilat Hayom Konei Eruv, the beginning of Shabbat, then Yamar Eruvuli Bazeh Amai Lo Amar Klum. Then it should work because he said, right, because at that moment, it's all worthwhile. You know, it's has value because it can be used. Amar Rav Papa disagrees with this assumption. And he says, Afilu Tema Tchilat Hayom Konei. You could still say that it's really the sunset, okay? In which case, you would say, right, maybe, I'm sorry, opposite. It's Tchilat Hayom is when nightfall happens, right? When the 3 stars come out. That's really the important moment. Now, what does Rav Papa have to explain? So if at nightfall, this wine magically, right, not magically, but, you know, it's almost like at that moment exactly, since you said at that moment, it's going to be Truma, and all of that happens at the exact moment, all happening at the same time, and your Eruv is Kona at that point, theoretically, it still won't work. And therefore, this doesn't prove anything. Because still, he says, Be'inan Suda Yami Ba'od Yom Veleka. You can't just have it all become valuable, you know, all become relevant right that moment, and it all kicks in right then. No. You have to, and it's a good question exactly why you would say this. But what he says is, and you have to think about it more, that you need for your Eruv, it needs to be something that's already ready from before Shabbat. It can't be something that became ready this moment. I was thinking it's like we go into Shabbat sometimes, you know, everything's right to the moment, right? We're not ready always, right when Shabbat's supposed to come in. So often we're still doing last minute things. And I think it's this idea that when Shabbat has to come in, not that, oh, this minute it's ready and boom. Like there has to be some sort of preparation. It has to be ready from before. It can't just be this moment it kicked in and, oh, great, it's all perfect. No. Your Eruv, if you're being Konesh Shvita, how do you Konesh Shvita? You don't just buy a house and you're in the house, right? There's preparation that has to be done. It has to be valuable before coming into it, and not that at the exact moment where it's Koneh, that's when it's important. So therefore, he says, theoretically, you can't derive anything from here about what's the important moment. Is it sunset, or is it when the 3 stars come out, right? Is it the beginning or at the end? No, it doesn't prove anything, because this just proves that it has to be something that was ready from before Shabbat, okay? That it can't be just ready at that moment. I'm not 100% sure why that's important, but that's what he's saying. Okay, now we get to another interesting case. These are all basically what we call Tanaim in conditions that one stipulates in his Eruv. So now, Matne Adam al Eruvo, this is a very strange case. He can make a condition on his Eruv. He can stipulate. Now, if you remember, what did I tell you? You have 2,000 Amma outside your city. But if you put an Eruv somewhere else, you lose your 2,000 Amma outside your city. And you only get that direction. What if you're an indecisive person and you want to leave your options open, okay? And you're not sure, do I want to go there or do I want to go there, right? We all know people like this, okay, right? You're not sure what you want to do. You want to leave it for Shabbat to decide. Or you want to depend it on something that's not dependent on you. It's not that you're indecisive. It's just you want to go somewhere, but you don't know where that somewhere is going to be. You want to be with someone or be without someone, okay? Be far away from someone, okay? We're going to talk about what those cases are. So you can stipulate. If the non-Jews are coming from the east, I want to be in the west. Okay, basically this is classic in the time of the Gemara, right? They were scared of a lot of the non-Jews. They were worried maybe it's the enemy coming, right? You want to be far away from them. So you're going to go the other way. Minama'ahav, or likewise, you could say the reverse, right? They're just kind of giving lots of cases. If he comes from the west, Eruvin Mizrach, my Eruv is going to be in the east. And if they're going to come, okay, these are the stipulations you make. If they're going to come from both directions, well, l'makom she'er tzelech, then I'll decide tomorrow. Okay, I'll decide on Shabbat. Lo ba'u, lo lakan, v'lo lakan, and if they're not going to come at all, then I don't want this Eruv, I don't want that Eruv. Where do I want to be? I want to be at home, and I want to be able to go 2,000 Amma outside my city in all directions. So, hareini kibnei iri. Then I just want to be like everybody else in my city. So you basically have 3 different options of where you're Konesh Shvita that time. Yes, I see the Steinsaltz says Goyim and not Nochrim. This is always a difference between different versions of the Gemara and what they called it, and it all has to do with the censorship. And so, yeah, you might have different wording than I do. This happens very often specifically in this word. Imba Chacham. Okay, now here's the next case. if there's a chacham coming to give a drasha, there's someone coming to give a shiur, and I want to go follow that person, but I don't know which way he's coming. So if he comes min mizrach, Eruvin mizrach. Here you're going in the direction, right? If he comes to the east, I want my eruv to be in the east. Min ma'arav, Eruvin ma'arav. Ba lekan u lekan, if he's going to go in either direction, right? Meaning there's going to be maybe two people coming. L'makom she'ertzeh lech. Then I'll decide on Shabbat. Lo lekan v'lo lekan. If he's not going to come at all, well then, hareini kibnei iri. I don't want that eruv. I don't want that eruv. I want to be able to just be like the people in my city. Rabbi Yehuda omer, im haya achad mehem rabo, holech etzel rabo. If one of them is his rabbi and one of them is some other darshan, well, you have to follow your rabbi. In other words, the assumption is that a person will normally go to their own rabbi and not to anyone else, and therefore that's going to be what's going to decide, and you don't get to choose. But if they were both his rabbis, then he can go wherever he wants. Now, this line of Rabbi Yehuda is going to cause us a lot of trouble, because it seems from this that Rabbi Yehuda thinks, and this is a concept that we're going to see a lot of times in the Gemara, it's called brera. Brera means, and this is what this is all about, that if I decide something later, okay, for our intents and purposes, it's on Shabbat, I can determine something from earlier, right? I can say, even though when Shabbat came in, it wasn't clear. Now, this is a whole strange concept. The whole idea is I'm konesh v'tam, I'm saying, this is my place for Shabbat. We're now basically allowing 3 potential places for Shabbat. And it's only going to be something that's determined on Shabbat. So when on Shabbat, whatever happens, and then I decide what, right? Then based on that, we're going to say, that's going to say that when Shabbat came in, that was really my Eruv, even though my decision was only made on Shabbat. It's a concept that yesh brera, we can say, if I do something now, then we can go and say that it basically makes what happened earlier as if it happened, right? My decision is if it happened earlier. We say yesh brera. But we're going to see. So it seems like this, Rabbi Yehuda holds yesh brera, because he says if they're both your rabbis, then you can decide wherever you want, which means that on Shabbat in the afternoon, let's say, you can determine what was from the beginning of Shabbat. And we're going to see that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold brera, and therefore they're going to have a lot of difficulty with this Mishnah, because Rabbi Yehuda elsewhere seems to say we don't hold by brera. And that's going to lead much more into tomorrow's sugya. Ki'ata Rabbi Yitzchak. When Rabbi Yitzchak came, so first we're going to stay off that topic, and we're going to say Rabbi Yitzchak came Tane Ifcha. He had Ifcha Kula Matnitin. He says the whole Mishnah he had opposite. Okay, what was opposite? The laws were the same, but the details were different. Fascinating. He had, if the non-Jew is coming from the east, then I want my Eruv to the east. And if the rabbi is coming from the west, I want my Eruv to the east. Okay, which is a little bit strange, right? You would think it would be the opposite. So they're now going to explain his Mishnah, his version. Kasha nochrim anochrim, kasha chacham chacham, right? Each of these cases are going to be difficult. Why in one is it going in the direction, the other one going out of the direction? Again, it's not a halachic issue, it's just the details of the case. So this becomes very interesting. Nochrim anochrim lo kasha, ha b'far hagvana, ha b'mari damata. When it's an army or a fleet or something like that of people, then you're going to want to run away. But when it's the head of the city, you might want to go talk to him. This could be for all sorts of reasons. Either you have a relationship with him, you want to deal with some issues that come up, or you have some complaints possibly, right? People always like to complain to the head of the city with all their problems. So either which way, right? It could be a sign of respect also to go respect right? And here it shows the issue that on the one hand, there were some nochrim that they had issues with, non-Jews they had issues with. On the other hand, there were some non-Jews that they had relationships with. So that could be the distinction. Chacham chacham lo kasha. This also is very interesting. Ha b'motiv pirkei, ha b'mikrei shma. One is someone who's teaching a shiur, and one is someone who's teaching shma to the children. Okay, so now it's a little bit tricky what this means. If he's teaching shma to the children, what, you're running away from him? That doesn't make sense. So the way some people explain it is, well, it means that there's two people. One is going this way, one is going that way, and you basically want to go to the one who's teaching this drasha and not the one who's teaching shma, because that's for the little kids and you're not a little kid. Well, it's a little tricky though, because the case was really one, right? And that's if he's coming from the Mizrach, then you want to go to Ma'arav. So the Aruch has a great commentary, and he says that it's the person's coming for money and you want to avoid them. The teacher, right? The Mikrei Shema are the ones who are coming to collect some money, maybe for the school or whatever it is. It's a little tricky because they're coming on Shabbat, but I guess when you see them, he's, just looking at him in the face, oh, I owe him money, and you basically want to avoid him because you don't want to get into any issues with him. So it's an interesting commentary, and it makes more sense with the pshat, that you're actually kind of running away from him. Okay, that was just an aside because it's not really a halachic issue, it was just about what the reality of the case is. But now we get back to this Rabbi Yehuda. So before we get to Rabbi Yehuda, we're going to deal with what the rabbis who disagree with him say. So Rabbi Yehuda says, if one of them is the rabbi, then you have to go, right? Then the assumption is that you obviously want to hear your rabbi and not the other person, and therefore that's where your Eruv is. But Rabbanan, who disagree with him, there's some people who'd rather go hear someone else, right? You hear your rabbi all the time. You might want to choose to go to hear somebody else. Chavre doesn't mean like go visit his friend, likely. It means go hear a different rabbi. Okay, Amar Rav. Now we get to the important part of this sugya. Because of this braita that Ayo brings, Ayo is a person who brought braitot, because of the braita that he brings, we're going to say that our Mishnah is incorrect. Okay, why? Here's the version of the braita that Ayo has. Ditane Ayo. Ayo said, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Ein Adam matneh al shnei dvarim ke'echad. You can't stipulate either this or this. Ela im haba chacham lemizrach, eruvo lemizrach. V'im ba chacham lemarav, eruvo lemarav. What can you do? You can say, if the chacham comes to the east, then I'm going to the east. If the chacham comes to the west, I'm going to the west. But lekanu lekan lo. But you can't say lekanu lekan. You can't say either direction it goes, right? You can't leave it. You can't leave it open to debate here. Okay, that's not an option because of what we said about brera. Rabbi Yehuda holds ein brera. So now they say ma'ishna lekanu lekan delo to ein brera. Lemizrach u'lemarav nami ein brera. Wait a minute. The whole thing is he holds ein brera, and it can't be determined later and then reflect back on the beginning of Shabbat, in other words, which was your real Eruv. Well, then it shouldn't work. The beginning of what we just said. If the Chacham comes to the Mizrach, then he said your Eruv is the Mizrach. That works. It's just you can't say Lakanu Lakan. So what's the difference? Rabbi Yochanan Kfar ba Chacham is very interesting. He says, in that case, the Chacham already showed up. In other words, the Chacham was on his way into the city. We already know, or not we know, but somebody knows he's either coming from the Mizrach or the Ma'arav. It's just that the person in the city who makes his Eruv doesn't know. That's not a case of indecisiveness and that he's going to decide later. This case, it's almost like predetermined, right? Like it's predetermined what we're going to do, but we don't yet know what we're going to do, right? So it's like that. He doesn't know what he's going to do, but it's clear when Shabbat starts where he's going to go because the Chacham is already on his way. So meaning it's clear when Shabbat started, even though he doesn't know it, that the Eruv is going to be, let's say, in the Ma'arav. Okay? That's not the same as when the person decides on Shabbat, which way am I going to go? And he's making a decision at the moment, right? Am I going this way? Am I going that way? That's not allowed, but the other case is allowed. So now the Gemara says, Adrabah, wait a minute. You want to basically say that we're going to reject our Mishnah because of Ayo, right? Adrabah, leita lida Ayo mimatnitin. We always would prefer to say, right, our Mishnah usually has much more strength over braitot. So why don't we say our Mishnah's wrong because of our Mishnah's right and Ayo's wrong? So they say lo salkadata. The hasham ina le Rabbi Yehuda delay le brera. The reason why we're going with Ayo is because we have a different source where it's clear from there that Rabbi Yehuda holds ein brera. And therefore, we're going to go by what we know to be the case in general and not by what our Mishnah says. In other words, we know that Rabbi Yehuda holds ein brera, and now we're going to get into one of the most famous sugyas. This is a very famous sugya in Shas about ein brera and about the sugya about taking Trumot and Masrot, and we're going to get into that tomorrow. So we'll pick up with that tomorrow. I see someone asked about who's Ayo. I didn't have time to research it, but maybe I'll look into it by tomorrow and see exactly who he is. I know he comes up. We've had him a few times, but I don't know if we've had him this cycle, but I remember him from previous times, but I don't remember so much about him. So if I can, I'll have time and I'll look it up for tomorrow. Okay, have a good day, everybody.